Astrid's warrior instincts screamed danger, yet her legs refused to retreat. The impossible sight of her name, Astrid Ironsdottir, carved in ancient runes among the weathered shields, sent ice through her veins that had nothing to do with the bitter Norwegian winter. Her grandfather had died 3 seasons before her birth. Everyone knew this. Her grandmother had told the story countless times during Astrid's childhood, how the great Bjorn Ravenspeaker had fallen defending their village from raiders, how he'd never lived to meet his granddaughter. So how could runes bearing her name look as old as the Longhouse itself? The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows across the circular hall. Astrid forced herself forward, boots crunching on scattered pine needles that shouldn't exist in a house abandoned for decades. Someone had been here recently, someone who knew she was coming. Her hand instinctively moved to the sacks at her belt, a habit drilled into her during 18 years of training under her father's merciless tutelage. Jarl Bjorn Ironson had forged her into a weapon, teaching her to read enemy movements like runes on stone, to strike faster than a serpent, to show no mercy in battle. Those same skills had ultimately led to her banishment when she'd refused his order to slaughter Saxon children during their last raid. Weakness, he'd spat, standing before their assembled clan as snow began to fall. My daughter has forgotten what it means to be Viking. The memory still burned, not just his words, but the faces of her kinsmen, warriors who'd fought beside her, shared mead with her, sworn blood oaths with her, all turning away as if she'd become invisible. Only her younger brother Eric had met her eyes, his face twisted with anguish he couldn't voice without defying their father. Astrid approached the wall of shields, studying each carved name. Sigrid Wolfsbane, Helga Stormcrow, Ragnhild the Fierce. Names she recognized from her grandfather's stories, legendary shield maidens from ages past. But there were others that felt foreign, written in runes she couldn't quite decipher. And at the end of the row, carved in wood that should have been ancient but looked fresh as yesterday's work, Astrid Ironsdottir, she who questions, not she who conquers or who fears nothing, titles a true warrior might earn. Instead, a name that captured the very flaw that had destroyed her life. A log collapsed in the fireplace, sending sparks spiraling upward like tiny stars. The sound made her spin, sacks half drawn, scanning the shadows between the support beams. Nothing moved, yet the feeling of being watched pressed against her shoulders like invisible hands. The Longhouse felt exactly as her grandfather's stories had described it, though she'd always assumed them to be tales spun for a child's entertainment. The great hearth dominated the center, surrounded by carved pillars depicting wolves and ravens locked in eternal chase. Faded tapestries hung between the beams, their once bright threads now muted by time and smoke. Along the walls, sleeping benches waited beneath thick firs that looked surprisingly well-maintained for an abandoned dwelling. But it was the silence that unnerved her most. Not the peaceful quiet of an empty house, but the expectant hush of a place holding its breath, waiting for something to begin. Astrid moved deeper into the hall, noting details that contradicted everything she'd been told. The wooden bowls stacked beside the hearth showed no dust. The water barrel near the door was full, its surface unfrozen despite the cold. Even the rushes covering the floor looked recently changed, sweet with the smell of dried herbs rather than the mustiness of decay. Someone lived here, someone who had prepared for her arrival. The iron key felt warm in her palm as understanding struck her like a blade between the ribs. Her grandfather, the grandfather who died before her birth, had told her to come here when the world turned its back on her, had given her a key to a house she'd never seen but somehow knew, had somehow carved her name and her fate onto a shield years before she existed. Unless the stories were wrong. Unless Bjorn Ravenspeaker hadn't died in that long-ago battle. Unless the man everyone called grandfather had secrets darker and stranger than winter nights. The aurora borealis chose that moment to intensify outside, painting the Longhouse walls in shifting green light that seemed almost alive. Through the high windows, Astrid could see the lights dancing with an urgency she'd never witnessed before, as if the very sky was trying to tell her something. She approached the great hearth where the fire burned with wood she hadn't placed, warmth she hadn't kindled. The stones around its base were covered in carved runes, not the simple markings she knew, but complex spirals and interwoven patterns that made her eyes water if she stared too long. And there, almost hidden beneath the hearthstone's edge, she spotted what looked like the corner of another carving. Something deliberate, something meant to be found. Astrid knelt in the firelight, brushing away decades of ash and soot, knowing with bone-deep certainty that whatever lay hidden beneath would change everything she thought she knew about her family, her fate, and herself. Her fingers traced the edge of the hidden carving, brushing away ash that felt strangely warm against her skin. The runes beneath emerged slowly, like secrets rising from deep water. But as the familiar symbols revealed themselves, Astrid's breath caught. These weren't ancient markings. They were fresh, carved in the style her grandfather had taught her through his stories, the way he'd described warriors marking their greatest victories, the way she had carved her own first kill into her shield's rim. The realization sent her rocking back on her heels. Someone had been watching her, studying her, learning her habits with the intimacy of a hunter tracking prey. Every shield on that wall, every prepared bowl, every perfectly maintained fur, it was all a stage set for her arrival. But by whom and why? The fire crackled, and in its dancing light, Astrid found herself remembering the life she'd lost. Just 3 days ago, she'd been Jarl Bjorn's heir, the daughter who could split a Saxon shield at 50 paces and drink any warrior under the table. Her days had followed the rhythm of clan life, dawn training with the younger warriors, afternoons maintaining weapons and gear, evenings in the great hall sharing stories and planning raids. She'd had a place then, a purpose. Warriors twice her age sought her counsel on battle tactics. Young shield maidens copied her fighting stance, hoping to earn even a fraction of her reputation. Her father's approval had been hard-won but treasured, each nod of satisfaction worth more than silver. All of it gone because she'd looked into a Saxon child's eyes and seen her own terror reflected back. Astrid pushed the memory aside, focusing instead on the carved runes before her. The pattern was becoming clearer now, not words, but a map. Lines radiating outward from a central point, marked with symbols she recognized as landmarks, the twin peaks of Trollhaven, the bent pine that marked the old hunting trails, the stone circle where her people had worshipped since the world was young. And at the center, surrounded by spiraling runes that seemed to shift in the firelight, was the symbol for threshold, the place between worlds. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, warm with the particular cadence he'd used for his most important stories. Some doors, little wolf, can only be opened when we have nothing left to lose. When the world strips away everything we thought we were, that's when we discover what we truly are. She'd been 7 when he'd told her that story, sitting in this very spot while winter raged outside. Or had she? The memory felt real, solid as the stone beneath her knees. Yet how could it be? Bjorn Ravenspeaker had died before her birth. Everyone knew this. Everyone except the man who'd somehow given her a key to his longhouse and whispered instructions that only she could hear. Astrid rose, pacing the length of the hall as she tried to make sense of impossible memories. She could recall summer afternoons spent learning to carve runes while her grandfather's weathered hands guided hers. The taste of honey cakes he'd make when she mastered a difficult technique. The stories he'd tell of ancient warriors who'd faced choices between duty and conscience, always ending with the same lesson. True strength isn't in the sword arm, little wolf. It's in knowing when not to use it, the very lesson that had destroyed her life. But if those memories were real, then everything else was a lie. Her father's grief over never knowing his father. Her grandmother's tears when she spoke of Bjorn's death. The songs the skalds sang of his heroic last stand. Or perhaps the lie was simpler and more terrible. Astrid returned to the hearth, studying the carved map with new understanding. If her grandfather lived, if he'd somehow survived that long-ago battle and hidden himself away in this forest sanctuary, then her banishment might not be the random cruelty it seemed. The timing was too perfect. Her questioning of her father's methods, her refusal to slaughter innocents, the mysterious dreams that had shown her this very longhouse. The aurora outside pulsed brighter, casting everything in that otherworldly green glow. Through the high windows, she could see the lights forming patterns that reminded her of the runic spirals carved around the hearth, as if sky and stone were speaking the same ancient language. A log shifted in the fire, and in the cascade of sparks that followed, Astrid glimpsed something that made her heart stop. There, carved into the hearthstone itself, and hidden by soot until this moment, was a single word in her grandfather's hand. Welcome. Not a greeting left for any wanderer who might stumble upon this place. The runes were too fresh, the carving too precise. This had been made for her, by someone who knew exactly when she would arrive and where she would look. Someone who had been waiting 28 years for his granddaughter to finally come home. Astrid sank to her knees before the hearth, understanding at last that her exile wasn't an ending but a beginning. Whatever truths lay hidden in this impossible place, whatever secrets her family had kept, she was finally ready to face them, because she truly had nothing left to lose. As Astrid knelt before the carved welcome, the weight of her grandfather's impossible greeting settled into her bones like winter cold. The fire's warmth couldn't touch the chills spreading through her chest. Not fear, but recognition. She'd felt this moment before, in dreams that had haunted her since childhood. Dreams where an old man with silver-streaked beard called her name across impossible distances. Dreams where she'd known exactly which stones to step on to cross the frozen stream outside. The realization struck her like a blade to the ribs. She'd never been here before, yet she knew this place with the intimacy of home. Knew that the third floorboard near the door would creak. Knew that behind the tapestry on the eastern wall, there would be a small alcove where her grandfather kept his most precious possessions. Knew because he'd been calling to her for 28 years, preparing her for this moment. Astrid pushed herself upright, legs unsteady as understanding crashed over her in waves. The banishment, the key, even her father's cruel rejection, none of it had been random. She was a piece in a game she'd never seen, moved by hands she'd thought were cold in the grave. The aurora pulsed again, and this time she heard it. Not the silent dance of light she'd known all her life, but something deeper. A humming that seemed to rise from the very stones of the longhouse, as if the building itself were alive and breathing. The sound made her teeth ache and her vision blur at the edges, because she was finally ready to see. The familiar longhouse wavered like a reflection in disturbed water. For just a moment, Astrid glimpsed something else beneath the illusion. Walls that stretched higher than any mortal structure should, filled with more shields than she could count, their carved names glowing with inner light. Hundreds of warriors, thousands, all women, all bearing weapons, all waiting. All watching her. The vision lasted only a heartbeat before the ordinary longhouse snapped back into place, leaving her gasping and clutching the hearthstone for support. But the memory of those countless warriors burned behind her eyes, and with it came the terrible certainty that she stood at the edge of something vast and ancient, something that would demand everything she had to give. You always were too clever for your own good, little wolf. Astrid spun toward the voice, sax clearing its sheath in one fluid motion. The blade sang as it cut the air, seeking the throat of whoever had spoken, but the hall remained empty, filled only with firelight and the aurora's eerie glow. Yet she knew that voice, had heard it in 100 dreams, 1,000 half-remembered stories. Grandfather. The word fell from her lips like a prayer and a curse combined. Where are you? Silence stretched between the carved pillars, broken only by the fire's crackle and her own hammering heartbeat. But the air itself felt different now, charged with possibility and terrible purpose. The very stones seemed to lean inward, waiting, listening. Astrid lowered her weapon but didn't sheath it. I know you're here. I can feel you watching, just like you've been watching my whole life, guiding me, preparing me. Her voice gained strength as understanding crystallized. The stories you told weren't just entertainment, were they? They were lessons, training. The greatest battles aren't won with sword and shield, little wolf. They're won by those willing to sacrifice everything for something greater than themselves. Another memory that felt more real than reality. Her grandfather's voice, patient and warm, as he taught her to see patterns in the stars, patterns that matched the carved map around the hearth, patterns that had led her here to this moment when she finally had nothing left to lose. The humming grew stronger, resonating through the floorboards and into her bones. The shields on the wall seemed to shimmer, their carved names shifting in the firelight, and slowly, impossibly, Astrid began to understand what was being offered to her, what was being demanded. She thought of her father's face as he'd pronounced her banishment, cold as winter stone, of her brother Eric's anguished expression as the clan turned away, of the Saxon child whose life she'd spared, whose grateful tears had cost her everything she'd thought she wanted, everything she'd thought she was. But standing in this impossible longhouse, surrounded by the echoes of warriors who'd faced the same choice, Astrid felt something else stirring in her chest. Not loss, but possibility. Not ending, but transformation. The aurora outside reached its peak intensity, painting the world in shades of prophecy and power. Through the high windows she could see the lights forming symbols, the same ancient runes that covered every surface of the Longhouse, speaking of duty and sacrifice and eternal guardianship, speaking of choice. Astrid stepped forward toward the carved map that promised answers and demanded everything in return. Her grandfather's voice whispered through the firelight, patient as winter, inexorable as fate. "Are you ready to learn who you really are, little wolf?" The moment balanced on a knife's edge, waiting for her answer, waiting for her to choose between the life she'd lost and the destiny that had been calling her name since before her birth. Astrid's hand trembled as she reached toward the carved map, then jerked back as if the stone had burned her. The weight of her grandfather's question hung in the air like smoke, demanding an answer she wasn't sure she could give. Who you really are. But what if she didn't want to know? What if the truth was worse than exile, worse than the crushing loneliness that had driven her through the forest to this impossible place? She'd spent her entire life believing she was Jarl Bjorn's heir, a Shieldmaiden destined for glory and a warrior's death. Now that identity lay in ashes, and something far stranger was being offered in its place. Something that required her to trust the word of a dead man who might not be dead at all. "I'm not ready," she whispered to the empty hall, backing away from the hearth. Her voice cracked like thin ice under weight. "I don't know what you want from me, but I can't." The aurora's humming grew louder, almost mocking in its persistence. Through the windows, she could see the lights swirling faster, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. The longhouse itself seemed to pulse with the same rhythm, as if her grandfather's heartbeat had somehow merged with stone and timber. As if he'd been waiting so long, he'd become part of the very foundations. Astrid pressed her palms against her temples, trying to shut out the impossible implications. 3 days ago, her greatest concern had been proving herself worthy of her father's approval. Now she stood in a place that shouldn't exist, surrounded by shields bearing names that spanned centuries, listening to voices from beyond the grave. And the worst part was how right it all felt. That terrified her more than anything else. Not the strangeness of it, but the deep recognition thrumming in her bones. As if this longhouse, these voices, this crushing weight of destiny had always been waiting for her. As if everything she'd thought was real had been nothing more than preparation for this moment. "What about choice?" she demanded, her voice echoing off the carved pillars. "What about my own will? You speak of destiny as if I'm just another piece on your game board, moved around for purposes I don't understand." Silence. But the kind of silence that suggested her grandfather was considering her words rather than dismissing them. She thought of Eric's face as the clan had turned away from her, the anguish in his eyes as he'd watched their father pronounce sentence. Her brother had wanted to speak. She'd seen it in the tension of his jaw, the way his hands had clenched at his sides. But he'd chosen silence over defiance, safety over loyalty to his sister. Had chosen, just as she was being asked to choose now. But Eric's choice had been between comfort and risk. Hers felt infinitely larger, weighted with implications she couldn't fully grasp. The shields on the wall seemed to whisper of warriors who'd made similar choices across the centuries, women who'd stepped away from ordinary lives into something vast and terrible, women who'd never returned to the lives they'd known. The Saxon child, Astrid said suddenly, the words torn from her throat. You knew I would spare him, knew it would destroy everything. Her hands curled into fists. You've been pulling strings my entire life, haven't you? Teaching me to question, to see beyond the simple answers everyone else accepted, making sure I'd become exactly the kind of person who couldn't slaughter innocents, making sure she'd be banished when the moment came. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Every story her grandfather had told, every lesson about mercy being a different kind of strength, every dream that had shown her this place, it had all been preparation for her exile. He'd shaped her into someone her own clan couldn't accept, knowing that only complete isolation would drive her here. Knowing that she'd need to lose everything before she'd be willing to become something else entirely. You bastard, she breathed. Tears she refused to shed burning behind her eyes. You took my life from me, my family, my clan, everything I was. You stole it all to serve your purposes. The fire flickered, and for just a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing beside the hearth, tall and silver-bearded, with eyes that held depths of sorrow and implacable will. Her grandfather's face, exactly as she remembered from dreams that shouldn't exist. I gave you the strength to choose mercy over cruelty, little wolf. The rest was always your decision. His voice carried no apology, no regret, only the patient certainty of someone who'd waited decades for this conversation. The figure faded like smoke, but his presence remained, pressing against her consciousness with the weight of absolute truth. Astrid stared at the carved map, understanding now that every line, every symbol represented not just geography, but destiny itself. Her destiny, laid out in stone by hands that had known exactly where her choices would lead. The question was whether she had the courage to see where that path truly went. For long moments, Astrid stood frozen before the carved map, her grandfather's words echoing through her mind like the toll of a funeral bell. The rest was always your decision. But what kind of choice was it really, when every path except one had been systematically closed off behind her? She could turn around, walk back through those massive doors, return to the forest, and try to forge some kind of existence in the wilderness. Live like a wolf among wolves, hunting and hiding until winter claimed her or raiders found her trail. Die as an exile, nameless and forgotten. She could step forward and discover what lay beyond the threshold. The aurora's humming crescendoed, and this time, Astrid didn't fight the vision that washed over her. The Longhouse walls dissolved like morning mist, revealing the vast hall she'd glimpsed before, endless rows of shields stretching up into darkness, each one bearing a name that glowed with inner fire. But now she could read them, could see the pattern that connected them across centuries of war and sacrifice. Sigrid the Truth-Seer, Helga Ironwill, Valdis the Merciful, all of them warriors, all of them women who'd been cast out, exiled, broken by the very people they'd tried to protect, and all of them united by a single carved symbol beneath their names, the same spiral rune that marked her grandfather's map, the rune that meant guardian. They were like me, Astrid whispered, understanding flooding through her like ice water, all of them, cast out for showing mercy, for questioning orders, for choosing conscience over blind obedience. The eternal struggle, little wolf. Every generation faces the same choice between easy cruelty and difficult compassion. Most choose the easier path. Her grandfather's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, woven into the very air she breathed. The vision solidified around her, and she found herself walking between the endless rows of shields, each name a story of sacrifice and loss. But a few choose differently. A few understand that some battles can only be won by those willing to lose everything in service of something greater. Astrid stopped before a shield near the center of the hall, her breath catching in her throat. The metal was newer than the others, the carving still sharp and clean, and the name etched into its surface made her knees buckle. Astrid Ironsdottir. No. The word tore from her throat like a battle cry. No, I won't be just another name on your wall of martyrs. I won't die for your mysterious greater good without even understanding what I'm dying for. But even as she spoke, her hand was reaching toward the shield, drawn by forces beyond her control. The metal felt warm beneath her palm, pulsing with the same rhythm as her heartbeat, and suddenly she could see them, glimpses of the other warriors who'd stood in this place, who'd made the choice she was facing now. Young women with old eyes, all of them broken by the world they'd tried to save. "What comes after?" she demanded, her voice echoing through the impossible hall. "What happens to Astrid Ironsdottir once she takes up this shield? Do I disappear into legend like the rest of them? Do I spend eternity guarding against threats I don't understand while the world moves on without me? You become what you were always meant to be, what you chose to be when you spared that Saxon child, knowing it would cost you everything." The hall shimmered, and suddenly Astrid was back in the ordinary longhouse, kneeling before the carved hearth with her hand still outstretched toward the stone map. But something had changed. The runes were glowing now, pulsing with soft golden light that seemed to emanate from deep within the rock itself. Calling to her, waiting for her answer. She thought of her father's face as he'd pronounced her banishment, cold and implacable as winter stone. Thought of Eric's anguish, her mother's tears, the way her entire clan had turned away as if she'd already ceased to exist. They'd cast her out for the crime of mercy, for refusing to become the weapon they wanted her to be. But maybe that had been the point. Maybe she'd never been meant to be their weapon at all. Astrid pressed her palm against the glowing runes, feeling their warmth spread up her arm and into her chest. Whatever lay beyond this threshold, whatever impossible duty or eternal guardianship awaited, it had to be better than the slow death of exile. Better than freezing in the forest with nothing but regrets for company. And maybe, just maybe, it was exactly what she'd been searching for all her life without knowing it. The carved map flared brighter at her touch, and she felt the stone beginning to shift beneath her hand. Mechanisms older than memory groaned to life, and the very floor started to tremble as hidden passages opened somewhere in the darkness below. There would be no going back after this. No return to the life she'd lost. No second chances with the family that had rejected her. But as the threshold opened before her, Astrid Ironsdottir smiled for the first time since her exile began. She was finally ready to find out who she really was. The stone beneath Astrid's palm grew burning hot, then ice cold, then seemed to dissolve entirely as hidden mechanisms ground to life. The floor lurched, tilting at an impossible angle as sections of carved stone rotated away from each other with the sound of grinding bone. She scrambled backward as the hearth itself split open, revealing a spiraling staircase that descended into luminous darkness. The aurora's light followed her down into the depths, streaming through cracks in the stone overhead like liquid starfire. Each step carried her deeper into the earth, past walls carved with runes that hurt to look at directly. The air grew thick with age and power, pressing against her lungs until each breath felt like swallowing honey. What am I walking into? The staircase ended at a circular chamber hewn from living rock. The walls curved upward into shadow, lined with alcoves that held objects she couldn't quite make out in the shifting light. At the center of the room stood a simple wooden table bearing 3 items, a silver arm ring inscribed with spiraling runes, a leather-bound book that seemed far too new for this ancient place, and a crystal vial filled with something that moved like captured moonlight. "Choose wisely, Shieldmaiden." Astrid spun toward the voice and nearly cried out in shock. A woman stood in the doorway, tall, silver-haired, wearing mail that gleamed like scales. But her eyes held depths that spoke of centuries, and when she moved, the light seemed to bend around her. Not entirely mortal. Not anymore. "Who are you?" Astrid's hand went to her sax, though she doubted mortal steel would help her here. "I am Valdis." The woman stepped into the chamber, and Astrid could see the faint glow beneath her skin, the way her footsteps left no mark on the stone floor. "I stood where you stand now, 400 years ago, made the choice you were about to make." Valdis the Merciful. One of the names from the vision. "You're dead." The words felt stupid even as Astrid spoke them, but the woman, the ghost, the guardian, whatever she was, smiled, with something that might have been compassion. Death is just another threshold, child. One I crossed in service of something greater. Valdis gestured to the 3 objects on the table. But you're not ready for that lesson yet. First, you must understand the rules of the world you're entering. Astrid's eyes fixed on the arm ring, which pulsed with the same rhythm as her heartbeat. What do they do? The arm ring will bind you to the eternal vigil. Once worn, it cannot be removed until your watch ends, either in victory or death. Valdis's voice carried no emotion, but Astrid caught the flicker of old pain in her translucent features. The book contains the true history of what we guard against, knowledge that will change how you see everything you thought you knew about the world. And the vial? As if reading her thoughts, Valdis continued. The draft grants clarity of sight, but at a cost. You will see the threads that connect all things, understand the pattern your grandfather has woven across generations, but you will also see every possible future, every path that leads to failure and ruin. It is not knowledge mortals are meant to bear. Astrid stared at the objects, understanding that this was another test, perhaps the most important one yet. I can only choose one? For now. Each choice will shape what kind of guardian you become, what trials you'll face in the darkness ahead. Valdis moved closer, and Astrid felt the chill of the grave radiating from her presence. But know this, once you choose, there will be no return to the life you knew. The woman who enters this chamber and the one who leaves are not the same. Just like her grandfather had said, like all of them had learned, what comes after? When I put on that arm ring or drink from that vial, what happens to me? Valdis's expression grew distant, as if she were looking through Astrid to some terrible future only she could see. You become part of something larger than yourself. You take up the burden your grandfather carried, and his grandfather before him. You stand watch against the darkness that sleeps beneath the world, stirring more restlessly with each passing year. The aurora light flared brighter, and suddenly Astrid could hear them. Whispers from the deep places of the earth, voices that spoke in languages that predated human speech. The ancient evil her grandfather's stories had only hinted at. The threat that required eternal vigilance from warriors willing to sacrifice everything. And soon, perhaps very soon, that vigil would be tested. Choose, Astrid Ironsdottir. Valdis stepped back, becoming more translucent with each word. But choose, knowing that this chamber has seen many who thought themselves ready. Not all who enter this room leave it unchanged. Some leave as guardians. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper that seemed to come from the stones themselves. Others leave as warnings. The chamber fell silent except for the steady drip of condensation from somewhere in the darkness above. Astrid stared at the 3 objects, her hands trembling as Valdis's warning echoed through her mind. Others leave as warnings. What kind of warnings? The question scraped from her throat like rusted metal. But Valdis was already fading, her form dissolving into wisps of pale light that danced around the alcoves before vanishing entirely. Astrid was alone again, standing before choices that could remake her very soul, or destroy it completely. This is madness. She backed away from the table, her shoulders hitting cold stone. I'm talking to ghosts, considering drinking potions that might kill me, all because some long-dead grandfather decided I was destined for something I never asked for. Yet even as the rational part of her mind rebelled, her eyes kept returning to the crystal vial. The liquid inside swirled with hypnotic patterns, and she found herself remembering every moment of confusion from the past days. Her grandfather's impossible appearance in dreams, the longhouse that shouldn't exist, the maps and shields that spoke of mysteries spanning centuries. What if understanding was worth any price? The whispers from below grew stronger, and with them came images that made her stomach clench. Glimpses of warriors who'd stood in this very chamber, reaching for objects that promised power or knowledge or purpose. Some had chosen the arm ring and walked out transformed, their eyes burning with grim determination. Others had opened the book and emerged hollow-eyed, weighted down by truths too terrible to bear. And some, Astrid saw them now in the dancing shadows, the ones who'd reached for the vial and never emerged at all. Their bones rested in the alcoves around the chamber's edge, still clutching empty crystal that had once held liquid starlight. Warriors who'd sought ultimate understanding and found only madness. The warnings Valdis had spoken of. "Grandfather," she whispered, hoping his presence still lingered somewhere in this place. "What did you see when you made this choice? What convinced you to bind our bloodline to something so vast and terrible?" The aurora light pulsed overhead, and suddenly the chamber was filled with echoes. Not sounds, but memories carved into the stone itself. She saw him as a young man, standing where she stood now, his face twisted with the same anguish that clawed at her heart. He'd lost everything too, she realized. Family, clan, identity, all sacrificed to bring him to this moment. But unlike her, he hadn't hesitated. She watched as his younger self reached for the arm ring without pause, sliding it onto his wrist with the certainty of someone who'd already counted the cost and found it acceptable. The binding had transformed him instantly, filling him with purpose and power and the crushing weight of eternal responsibility. He'd chosen duty over understanding, service over knowledge. The memory shifted, showing her glimpses of his long vigil, decades spent watching for signs of stirring darkness, preparing defenses, weaving plans that would span generations. He'd married, had children, trained them all for the day when his watch would end and the burden would pass to another. To her. But what if I choose differently? Astrid stepped closer to the table, studying each object in turn. What if I take the book instead, learn what we're truly fighting before I bind myself to anything? What if I drink from the vial and see all possible futures before deciding which path to walk? The whispers from below rose to a crescendo, and she felt something stir in the depths, something vast and patient and infinitely hungry. Whatever slept beneath the world was indeed stirring, drawn perhaps by her presence in this place, by the proximity of another potential guardian, or another potential failure. Astrid's hand hovered over the crystal vial, drawn by the promise of absolute clarity, to see the threads that connected all things, to understand her grandfather's true plan, to know with certainty what lay ahead. It would be worth any risk, wouldn't it? Unless knowledge without power was just another form of helplessness. She shifted toward the arm ring, feeling its pull like gravity itself. To be transformed as her grandfather had been, to become something more than human, to gain the strength needed for whatever trials awaited. That made the most practical sense. But what if strength without understanding led to the same blind obedience she'd rejected in her father's hall? The book lay between them, leather binding unmarked by age, promising truths that would reshape everything she thought she knew about the world. Perhaps wisdom was worth more than power or foresight. Perhaps knowing why was more important than knowing how or when. The chamber seemed to hold its breath as Astrid reached out, her fingers hovering inches above her choice. In the alcoves around her, the bones of those who'd chosen wrongly gleamed like pearls in the aurora light. Whatever she decided now would echo through eternity. And in the darkness below, something ancient and terrible waited to see what kind of guardian, or warning, Astrid Ironsdottir would become. Astrid's fingers closed around the crystal vial. The moment her skin touched the smooth surface, every voice in her head screamed in unison. Her own rational mind, the whispers of ancient guardians, even the stirring presence from the depths below. All of them knew she'd made the wrong choice. All of them understood what was coming. But it was too late to reconsider. The vial grew scorching hot, then cold enough to burn, fusing itself to her palm like molten metal. She tried to drop it, to pull away, but her hand wouldn't obey. The crystal had become part of her flesh, and the liquid inside began to glow with the intensity of a captive star. No. The word tore from her throat as understanding crashed over her. This wasn't a test of wisdom or courage, it was a trap. The bones in the alcoves weren't warnings about failure. They were bait, positioned to make her believe she could avoid their fate by choosing differently. Every guardian candidate was meant to reach for the vial eventually. Meant to see what she was about to see. The liquid poured into her bloodstream like liquid fire, and Astrid's world exploded into infinite fragments of possibility. She saw herself in the chamber, making the choice 1,000 different ways, reaching for the arm ring first, opening the book, walking away entirely. But every path led here, to this moment, to the vial burning through her veins like molten starlight. Because someone had to see, someone had to understand the true scope of what they faced. The vision slammed into her consciousness with brutal force. She saw the thing that stirred beneath the world. Older than gods, older than the earth itself. A presence of such vast malevolence that it made her father's cruelty seem like a child's tantrum. It had been sleeping for millennia, held in check by barriers that grew weaker with each passing year. And it was almost awake. Astrid collapsed to her knees as more knowledge flooded through her. The Guardians weren't just watchers, they were anchors, living seals that reinforced the ancient bindings. Each generation had to produce at least one willing soul to take up the vigil, or the barriers would fail entirely. Her grandfather had known this, had spent decades preparing her, guiding her choices, ensuring she would end up exactly here. "You knew," she gasped, speaking to his ghost or memory or whatever fragment of him still haunted this place. "You knew the vial would choose me, knew I was never meant to be a guardian like you." The aurora light pulsed in response, and she felt his presence settle around her like a shroud. "Forgive me, little wolf, but someone had to see the whole pattern. Someone had to understand what failure truly means." The visions continued their relentless assault. She saw herself in possible futures where she'd chosen the arm ring, standing watch for decades, growing old and hollow-eyed as the barriers slowly weakened despite her efforts. She saw timelines where she'd read the book first, paralyzed by knowledge of past failures, unable to act decisively when the moment came. Only this path led to understanding. Only this choice revealed the truth that had been hidden from every previous guardian. The ancient evil wasn't stirring randomly. It was being awakened deliberately, by something that moved in the spaces between worlds. Something that had been systematically corrupting the guardian lines for generations, ensuring that each new protector would be slightly less prepared, slightly more broken than the last. The exile hadn't been punishment. It had been contamination. Astrid saw her father's face in the visions, but not as she remembered it. The cruel certainty in his eyes wasn't entirely his own. Something else looked out through them, something that had been whispering poison in his ear for years. The same presence that had influenced her clan's increasingly brutal tactics, that had pushed them toward the kind of mindless cruelty that would inevitably corrupt or exile any warrior with genuine honor. They'd been played, all of them. Cast as actors in a drama designed to produce the exact kind of broken guardian the enemy needed. "Except I'm not broken," she whispered, even as blood ran from her nose and the visions threatened to tear her sanity apart. "I'm exactly what you didn't expect." The presence from below stirred more violently, and she felt its attention focus on her like the weight of mountains. It had been counting on another hollow guardian, another warrior too damaged by exile to think clearly. Instead, it had gotten someone who could see the pattern, who understood how deeply the corruption ran, someone who might actually be able to fight back. But the knowledge was killing her. She could feel her mind beginning to fracture under the weight of infinite possibilities, her body burning from within as the vial's contents rewrote her very essence. The bones in the alcoves weren't failures. They were previous seers who'd seen too much, understood too clearly, and paid the ultimate price for clarity. Unless, through the agony, Astrid remembered something her grandfather had taught her as a child: how to anchor herself when the world became too vast to comprehend, how to find solid ground when everything else turned to chaos. Focus on what matters. Focus on who you choose to be. She was Astrid Ironsdottir. She'd been cast out for choosing mercy over cruelty, and she would not let that choice be turned into a weapon against everything she'd tried to protect. The ordeal was just beginning. The anchoring technique lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. Then the visions returned with vengeance that made the first assault seem gentle. Astrid's consciousness shattered into 1,000 fragments, each one experiencing a different timeline simultaneously. She was herself at 8 years old, learning sword forms in her father's hall. She was herself at 50, standing over his grave with tears she couldn't shed. She was herself dying in childbirth, in battle, of old age, of madness, all at once, all equally real. This is why the others never left the alcoves. The crystal vial had fused completely with her palm now, its surface rippling like liquid mercury. Through her splayed fingers, she could see the bone fragments of previous seers shifting in their resting places, drawn by the resonance of another mind being torn apart by infinite knowledge. "I can't." The words dissolved into a scream as she experienced every possible version of the conversation with her father that had led to her exile. In some timelines, she'd bent the knee and accepted his cruelty. In others, she'd drawn steel and died on his hall's stones. But in every version, the corruption behind his eyes grew stronger, fed by her pain. That was the point. Every choice had been designed to strengthen it. The presence from below sent tendrils of attention upward, tasting her anguish like wine. She felt its satisfaction as her sanity cracked further, felt its hunger for the moment when she would join the bones in the alcoves and leave the barriers one guardian weaker. But she also felt something else, something it hadn't expected: rage. Pure, incandescent fury at being manipulated, at her grandfather's deception, at her father's corruption, at the ancient thing that thought her pain was just another ingredient in its awakening feast. The rage gave her something to hold on to, a core of heat that couldn't be dissolved by infinite possibilities. "You made a mistake," she snarled through blood-flecked lips. "You showed me everything, including how to hurt you." The visions had revealed the entity's true nature, not just a sleeping evil, but something that existed partially outside of time itself. It could see potential futures, influence past events through willing agents, weave patterns across generations. But that vast perspective came with a fatal weakness. It experienced every moment simultaneously, including the ones where it failed. Astrid forced herself to focus on those specific timelines, the futures where the barriers held, where humanity survived, where the ancient thing remained bound in eternal sleep. The entity recoiled from her attention, suddenly understanding what she intended. If she could make one of those timelines real. But the effort was killing her. Blood poured from her eyes now, and she could feel her heart stuttering under the strain. The vial's contents had never been meant for mortal vessels. They were pure distilled truth, and truth in that concentration was poison to anything human. The bones in the alcoves began to glow, resonating with her pain, and in that resonance she heard their whispers. Not warnings, but encouragement. Every previous seer who died in this chamber, all of them reaching across death to lend her their strength. "See it through, sister. Make our sacrifice mean something. Show it what guardians truly are." But their support only hastened her dissolution. Astrid could feel herself becoming like them. Consciousness unmoored from flesh, awareness spread across too many possibilities to maintain coherence. The person she'd been was fragmenting. Pieces of her identity scattered across infinite potential selves. "I'm losing myself." The realization brought fresh terror. Even if she succeeded in blocking the entity's awakening, she wouldn't live to see victory. The knowledge would consume her completely, leave her as another warning for the next candidate who entered this chamber. Unless that was the point. Unless someone had to make this sacrifice. Through the cascade of visions, she saw her grandfather's true plan at last. Not just to create a guardian, but to create a seer powerful enough to perceive the entity's weaknesses and willing enough to exploit them at the cost of everything. He'd shaped her entire life for this moment, taught her to value others' welfare over her own survival, given her the moral flexibility to break rules when breaking them served the greater good. Even the rule about choosing only one item from the table. With her remaining strength, Astrid lunged toward the silver arm ring. Her free hand closed around it just as the vial's final surge of knowledge threatened to scatter her consciousness beyond all recovery. The ring's binding power slammed into her like a physical blow, and suddenly she had an anchor point, something to hold her fragmenting self together. The entity's roar of fury shook the chamber, but it was too late. Astrid existed in two states now, the dying seer whose mind spanned all possibilities, and the bound guardian whose will could not be broken. The combination created something unprecedented, something that could rewrite the pattern itself, but the price would be everything she'd ever been. The transformation began in the space between heartbeats. Astrid felt herself dissolving and reforming simultaneously, caught between the vial's infinite knowledge and the arm ring's binding force. Her consciousness stretched across every possible timeline while her guardian's will anchored her to a single purpose. The contradiction should have destroyed her, would have destroyed anyone else. But she wasn't anyone else. Not anymore. The chamber erupted in blinding light as two incompatible magics fused within her mortal frame. The aurora above twisted into impossible patterns, and the bones in the alcoves crumbled to dust as their stored anguish was consumed by her transformation. She was becoming something that had never existed before. Not just a guardian, not just a seer, but a living junction point between fate and choice. Through the agony, revelation blazed like lightning. The guardians had always been meant to fail. Not through weakness or corruption, but by design. Every generation of watchers had been a delaying action, buying time for this moment, when someone would finally possess both the knowledge to see the entity's true nature and the power to act on that knowledge. Her grandfather's betrayal hadn't been betrayal at all, but the culmination of a plan centuries in the making. A plan that required her to become the very thing the entity feared most. The ancient presence below writhed in its bonds, no longer patient or confident. Through her expanded awareness, Astrid could see its true form, not a creature of malice but of entropy itself. It didn't seek to rule or destroy in any conventional sense. It simply wanted to return the universe to the primordial void from which all things had emerged. And it was terrified, because she could see now how the pattern really worked. The corruption in her father, the systematic weakening of guardian lines, the careful orchestration of her exile, none of it had been the entity's doing. It had all been arranged by something else, something that had been playing both sides of this cosmic game for millennia. The leather-bound book on the altar burst into flames, revealing its true nature at last. Not a repository of knowledge, but a focus for the real enemy. The void touched intelligence that had been manipulating events from outside time itself. It had wanted the entity awakened not to serve it, but to use the chaos of its rising to tear open barriers between worlds. To let in things far worse than any sleeping god. "You aren't the enemy," Astrid whispered, her voice echoing strangely as it resonated across multiple timelines. She was speaking to the presence below, but also to the darkness between stars, to the intelligence that had orchestrated everything. "You're just another victim, another prisoner." The entity's struggles ceased. Through her enhanced perception, she felt its confusion, then something that might have been hope. It had been bound so long that it had forgotten why the chains were forged, not to imprison a destroyer, but to protect a guardian. The presence below wasn't evil. It was the world's first and greatest defender, driven mad by eons of isolation and manipulation. And she was its successor. The truth rewrote everything she thought she knew. The guardian bloodline didn't just watch for the entity's awakening. It was bred to eventually join with it, to heal the madness born of eternal solitude. Her grandfather had seen this possibility in his visions, but lacked the power to achieve it. The arm ring alone wouldn't have been enough. The vial alone would have killed her. But both together, chosen freely, created something unprecedented. Astrid rose to her feet, no longer entirely human but not yet lost to transformation. The crystal vial had become part of her left hand, its surface pulsing with captured starlight. The silver arm ring blazed on her right wrist, its runes shifting to accommodate new bindings. She existed simultaneously in the chamber and in the space between worlds, seeing all possibilities while remaining anchored to her chosen path. The void intelligence struck then, realizing its carefully laid plans were unraveling. Dark tendrils erupted from the ashes of the burning book, reaching for her mind with the intent to corrupt or destroy. But they passed through her harmlessly. She was no longer solid enough to be touched, no longer limited enough to be contained. The exile hadn't been her punishment. It had been her liberation. Cut free from clan loyalties and family expectations, She'd become exactly what this moment required. Someone with no allegiances except to her own moral compass. The void intelligence had shaped her perfectly for its purposes, never realizing it was creating its own defeat. Astrid smiled, feeling the presence below stir in response to her thoughts. Ancient, patient, and finally, after eons of madness, no longer alone. "Thank you, grandfather," she whispered, understanding at last why he'd needed her to choose this path. "I see the real pattern now," and with that seeing came the power to rewrite it entirely. The true battle was just beginning, but for the first time in centuries, the forces of preservation had a chance of victory. Because Astrid Ironsdottir had become something that existed outside the enemy's calculations, a guardian who could think, a seer who could act, and a human soul that refused to accept defeat, even if it cost her everything she'd ever been. The communion began with silence so profound it seemed to have weight. Astrid felt her consciousness descend through layers of stone and time, drawn inexorably toward the presence that had waited beneath the world for millennia. The ancient guardian's mind touched hers with infinite gentleness, a vast intelligence that had learned patience through eons of madness and isolation. "Sister," came the greeting, shaped not in words but in pure understanding. Finally, through their connection, knowledge flowed between them like blood-sharing veins. She experienced fragments of the guardian's memories, the first binding, when it had willingly accepted imprisonment to hold back the void-touched entities that sought to devour reality itself. The slow descent into madness as centuries passed without contact, without purpose beyond endless watching. The moment when isolation became so complete that it had begun to forget why it endured. But now we are two, where once there was only one. Astrid felt the guardian's consciousness stabilizing as her presence provided an anchor point for its scattered thoughts. In return, its vast reserves of accumulated power flowed into her, teaching her body how to exist in multiple states simultaneously without dissolving entirely. "The void intelligence," she said, the words echoing through both the chamber and the space between worlds. "It's still out there." "Yes, but weakened now. It counted on our separation, on maintaining the madness that kept me from acting rationally." The guardian's attention turned upward, toward threats that existed beyond the physical realm. There are others like it. Many others. They probe the barriers constantly, seeking any crack that might allow them entry. Through their shared awareness, Astrid perceived the true scope of what they faced. The void entities existed in the spaces between realities, feeding on entropy and chaos. Each time one managed to establish a foothold in the physical world, it would begin the process of unraveling local space-time, creating doorways for its kin. The guardian bloodline was never just about watching. It was about preparation, building toward this moment when the barriers could be reinforced from within and without. "But the cost," Astrid whispered, feeling her human memories beginning to blur at the edges as divine knowledge settled into her mind. "I can feel myself changing, becoming something else. Not something else, something more." The guardian's presence wrapped around her like a protective shroud. The woman who chose mercy over cruelty, who valued truth over comfort, that core remains. Everything else is simply expansion. She felt the truth of it. Her essential self persisted, but now it was supported by cosmic awareness and power that dwarfed her previous limitations. The fear of abandonment that had driven so many of her choices was transforming into something greater, a fierce protectiveness that encompassed not just her clan or her people, but all of existence itself. "Show me what we must do." The visions that followed were different from the chaotic assault she'd endured earlier. These came with structure and purpose, revealing the network of weak points in reality's fabric where void entities might attempt to break through. She saw other guardians scattered across different times and places, some successful, others falling to corruption or despair, all of them part of a vast pattern of defense that had protected the world for countless ages. But the pattern is changing. The enemy adapts, learns from each failure. We must adapt as well. Astrid nodded, understanding flowing through her enhanced awareness. The traditional model of solitary guardians was becoming obsolete. What the world needed now was active protection, dynamic responses to threats that could strike anywhere across space and time. "We need allies," she said. "The other guardians, the ones still fighting alone. Can we reach them?" "Through you, yes. The transformation has made you a bridge between the physical realm and the spaces beyond. You can walk between worlds, carry messages across centuries if necessary." The implications staggered her. Not just the responsibility, but the opportunity. For the first time since the first binding, the forces of preservation could coordinate their efforts, share knowledge and resources across the entire network of reality's defenders. But first, we must secure this nexus point. The Void Intelligence's attack has damaged the barriers here. If we cannot repair them quickly— Astrid felt the urgency like a physical pressure. Through her expanded senses, she could perceive hairline fractures in the dimensional walls, stress points where reality had worn thin under the sustained assault. The ancient guardian's power alone wouldn't be sufficient to restore them, but combined with her ability to act in the physical world— "Tell me what to do." The repair work began immediately, Astrid serving as the guardian's hands while it provided the vast energies necessary for dimensional reconstruction. She moved through the chamber with inhuman grace, her partially transformed body able to interact with forces that would have been invisible to purely mortal perception. As they worked, she felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't experienced since her exile— hope, not just for survival, but for victory. The Void entities had planned for another generation of broken guardians, another century of gradual weakening. Instead, they faced something unprecedented— a unified defense that could strike back across multiple realities simultaneously. The exile had been her liberation. Now it would become their salvation. The road back. The dimensional repairs took 3 days and nights, though time moved strangely in the space between worlds. Astrid worked without rest, her transformed body sustained by energies that flowed through the Guardian's connection. Each fracture in reality required delicate weaving, like stitching wounds that existed in dimensions her human mind couldn't fully comprehend. There, the ancient Guardian's voice resonated through her consciousness as they sealed the final breach. The barriers hold once more. But this was only the beginning. Astrid straightened, feeling the weight of what lay ahead settle upon her shoulders. Through their shared awareness, she could perceive other weak points scattered across the world, some already under attack, others showing the telltale signs of Void Intelligence infiltration. The enemy hadn't been idle during the centuries of preparation. "My father," she said suddenly, remembering the corruption that had twisted his heart toward unnecessary cruelty. The changes in his war tactics, the way he began targeting innocent settlements— that was them, wasn't it? Yes. They work through willing vessels, feeding on existing darkness until it overwhelms the host's moral restraints. Your chieftain was proud, ambitious, fertile ground for their influence. The revelation brought fresh pain, but also clarity. Her exile hadn't just been about destiny or ancient prophecies, it had been about removing her from a situation where she might have been corrupted as well. Her questions, her challenges to her father's methods, they had marked her as both a threat to Void Intelligence plans and a potential asset if she could be turned. But you chose differently. Even in exile, even facing death, you chose preservation over destruction. That choice echoes across all realities now. Through the chamber's restored barriers, Astrid felt the network of guardians like distant stars in her awareness. Some burned bright and steady, anchored by certainty of purpose. Others flickered with doubt or desperation. A few had gone dark entirely, their lights extinguished by failure or corruption. "We need to reach them," she said, her voice carrying new harmonics that hadn't been there before. "The ones who still fight, they need to know they're not alone," Dot agreed. "But first, you must understand the full scope of what we face." The Guardian's consciousness expanded around her, sharing memories that stretched back to the very first incursion. She saw the Void entities in their true form, not creatures of malice, but of pure entropy. They didn't hate existence so much as find it untidy. Their goal wasn't conquest but simplification, returning the complex patterns of reality to the clean emptiness from which everything had emerged. They are patient beyond mortal comprehension. What seems like defeat to them is merely data collection for the next attempt. Then we need to be smarter, Astrid said, her tactical mind already working through the implications. Unpredictable. The void intelligence that's been manipulating events. It thinks in patterns, probabilities. If we can act outside its calculations, you begin to see why this transformation was necessary. A guardian alone, or a seer alone, could only react to their moves. But together, we can initiate. The plan that formed between them was audacious in its scope. Rather than simply defending against void entity incursions, they would actively hunt the sources of corruption, striking at weak points in the enemy's network before attacks could be fully coordinated. It would require abandoning the traditional guardian's role as passive watcher in favor of something far more dangerous. There will be consequences, the ancient presence warned. Acting so directly will make you a target. Every void intelligence in existence will turn its attention towards stopping you. Good, Astrid replied with fierce satisfaction. Let them come. I'm tired of dancing to their patterns. But even as she spoke, she felt the weight of what she was choosing. The woman who had entered this chamber 3 days ago was gone forever, replaced by something that existed partially outside normal space-time. She could never return to her clan, never live a simple human life. The path ahead led only deeper into cosmic responsibilities that would span centuries at minimum. The fear of abandonment still haunts you, the Guardian observed gently. But consider, you are choosing to abandon no one. Instead, you become the protector of all. The truth of it settled into her bones like winter cold. Every connection she had ever valued, to family, to clan, to the simple certainties of mortal existence, had been sacrificed to forge something greater. But in return, she gained connection to every soul that would ever need protection from the void's hunger. Show me how to reach the others, she said, her resolve crystallizing into diamond-hard purpose. The guardians who still fight. It's time to change the rules of this war. The aurora above pulsed in response to her words, its unnatural intensity spreading across the sky like a signal fire. Through the network of dimensional barriers, Astrid felt answering flickers from guardian sites around the world. Some surprised, others hopeful, a few wary of this unprecedented communication. The void entities expected another century of gradual weakening. Instead, they face coordinated resistance that can strike across time itself. As her consciousness prepared to journey beyond the physical realm, Astrid felt one last pang of loss for the simple life she would never know. Then it was swept away by purpose vast as the stars themselves. The final battle was about to begin. The aurora above exploded into patterns that defied comprehension, its light fracturing into geometric shapes that existed in too many dimensions simultaneously. Astrid felt her consciousness stretch across the barriers between worlds, reaching toward the scattered guardians with the desperate urgency of a battle cry. First contact, the ancient guardian whispered through their shared awareness. Tread carefully. Some have been alone so long they may mistake aid for attack. The nearest presence responded immediately, a guardian stationed beneath what would one day become Constantinople, his mind sharp with centuries of vigilant discipline. Through their connection, Astrid felt his shock at the unprecedented contact, followed quickly by fierce hope. Sister? His mental voice carried the weight of Roman authority mixed with something far older. How is this possible? The patterns are changing, she replied, her words rippling across dimensional barriers like stones thrown into still water. We're no longer fighting alone. But even as she spoke, she felt the void intelligences stirring in response to their communication. The network she was building blazed like a beacon in the spaces between worlds, drawing hostile attention with terrifying speed. They come, the guardian beneath Constantinople warned, multiple entities converging on your position. More than I've ever sensed moving together. Astrid's enhanced perception confirmed his words. Dark shapes were sliding through the cracks between realities, void entities drawn by the unprecedented coordination between guardians. But there was something else, a vast intelligence directing their movements with surgical precision. The same presence that had orchestrated her exile, manipulated her father, guided her to this moment of maximum vulnerability. It wants to break the network before it can fully form, the ancient guardian realized. Cut off the communication before we can coordinate our defenses. Then we don't give it the chance, Astrid said, her voice carrying new harmonics of power and determination. Everyone who can hear me, now is the moment. Not tomorrow, not when we're better prepared. Now. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Guardian sites across the world flared to life as their protectors drew upon reserves of power that hadn't been tapped in generations. She felt their presence like stars igniting in her awareness. A woman warrior beneath the pyramids of Egypt, a Viking berserker guarding the northern reaches of Greenland, a Celtic druid maintaining wards in the deep forests of what would become England. Each connection brought knowledge flooding back to her, tactics the void entities used, patterns they followed, weaknesses they tried to hide. But it also brought something more dangerous, their accumulated despair, their bone-deep exhaustion after centuries of solitary vigilance. Unity has a price, she realized, as the emotional weight of dozens of guardians pressed against her consciousness. Their pain becomes mine. The first wave of void entities struck then, not against the physical realm but against the network itself. They attacked the connections between guardians, seeking to sever the links before they could stabilize into permanent communication. Astrid felt the assault like needles of ice driven through her skull, each entity probing for psychological weaknesses to exploit. "You abandoned your family," they whispered in harmonics that bypassed conscious thought. "Your clan suffers while you play at cosmic importance. Your father dies believing his daughter hated him." The words carried visions. Her village burning under foreign raiders, her brothers falling in battle without her spear arm to aid them, her father calling her name with his final breath. Each image was perfectly crafted to destroy her concentration, to make her choose between cosmic duty and human love. But Astrid had learned something in the depths of transformation. The fear of abandonment could be a weakness, or it could be the strongest possible motivation to protect those who mattered. "I haven't abandoned them," she said, her voice resonating across multiple realities as she spoke to the void intelligences directly. "I've become their ultimate guardian. Every choice you force me to make only proves why you must be stopped." Power flowed through the guardian network then, all of them working in perfect synchronization, for the first time in recorded history. Where individual guardians had once struggled to maintain local barriers, their combined strength allowed them to push back, to actually drive the void entities away from reality's foundations. "Impossible," came the shocked response from the intelligence that had orchestrated everything. The pattern was perfect, your isolation guaranteed, your despair calculated to the precise degree. "You made one mistake," Astrid replied, feeling the ancient guardian's vast strength flowing through her as she prepared for the true confrontation. "You assumed I would choose the way warriors have always chosen, between duty and love, between the many and the few. But I'm not just a warrior anymore." Around her, the chamber began to change as reality itself responded to the unprecedented gathering of guardian power. The walls became translucent, revealing the vast network of dimensional barriers that protected existence itself. And beyond those barriers, she could see the void entities massing for a final, desperate assault. Everything we've learned, everything we've sacrificed, it all comes down to the next few moments. The final test had begun. Chapter 14, The Confrontation. The void intelligence materialized before Astrid not as shadow or whisper, but as a being of crystalline geometry that hurt to perceive directly. Its form shifted through dimensions her enhanced awareness could barely track, angles folding into themselves in patterns that suggested infinite complexity compressed into finite space. "You have exceeded our calculations," it said, its voice carrying the weight of eons and the cold certainty of mathematics. "This requires adjustment." The chamber around them exploded outward, walls dissolving to reveal the true battlefield, a space between realities where the laws of physics bent to accommodate forces that predated existence itself. Astrid found herself standing on nothing, surrounded by the swirling chaos of creation's edge, while the network of guardians burned like stars in her peripheral awareness. "Your calculations were flawed from the beginning," she replied, her transformed body adapting to the impossible environment. "You measured human fear, but ignored human love, calculated despair, but missed hope." The entity's form rippled with something that might have been amusement. "Hope is merely delayed disappointment. Love is chemical bonding that evolution selected for species survival. We have observed your kind for millennia. Every noble sacrifice eventually corrupts into selfish preservation." As it spoke, reality flickered around them, showing scenes from across history, guardians falling to temptation, choosing personal desires over cosmic duty, or simply breaking under the weight of endless vigilance. Each failure fed into the void intelligence's certainty, its unshakable belief that entropy always triumphed over order. But Astrid felt the Guardian network pulsing with unified purpose behind her. Through their connection, she could sense each of her fellow protectors drawing strength from the knowledge that they no longer fought alone. The Roman Guardians' discipline, the Egyptian warriors' fierce determination, the Celtic druids' deep connection to natural forces, all of it flowing together into something greater than the sum of its parts. "Show it something new," the ancient Guardian whispered through their bond. "Something it hasn't calculated for." "You're right about one thing," Astrid said, stepping forward into the void intelligence's presence despite the reality distortions that tried to tear her apart. "Isolation does corrupt. Loneliness does break the spirit. But you made one critical error in your calculations." She reached out through the network, not just to the Guardians she had already contacted, but deeper, to the sleeping defenders, the ones who had withdrawn from the world in despair, the ones who believed they had failed beyond redemption. Her consciousness touched each of them with the warmth of connection, showing them that their sacrifices had meaning, that their vigil had value. The void intelligence's form began to shift more rapidly as Guardian sites across the globe blazed back to life. Powers that had lain dormant for centuries awakened with the fury of volcanoes breaking through ice. The network expanded exponentially, reaching forward and backward through time to touch protectors who had died believing themselves failures. Impossible. The pattern holds across all iterations. Individual strength always fails. "You're still thinking like a machine," Astrid said, her voice carrying harmonics from dozens of connected guardians. "You see individuals and assume they must eventually stand alone. But we're not individuals anymore. We're not even a network." The truth crystallized as she spoke it, understanding flowing through the Guardian consciousness like sunlight through crystal. What they had become transcended the void intelligence's mathematical models because it was something genuinely new in the history of the universe, a collective entity that retained individual personality while sharing purpose and power across space and time. We are what humanity was always meant to become. The void intelligence recoiled, its crystalline form cracking as it encountered something outside its predictive models. The attack it launched then was pure entropy, not physical force, but conceptual dissolution, attempting to break down the very idea of their unity by showing each guardian that their companions were illusions. That connection itself was just another lie they told themselves to avoid confronting cosmic insignificance. But Astrid had felt the truth of their bond in the deepest chambers of her transformed consciousness. She knew the Romans' steadfast honor, the Egyptians' protective fury, the Druids' patient wisdom, not as concepts or memories, but as lived experiences that had become part of her own essence. "You cannot dissolve what was never separate to begin with," she said, her form beginning to glow with accumulated guardian power. "You mapped human fear perfectly, but you never understood human connection. We were never just defending reality from you. We were evolving into something you cannot touch." The void intelligence's attack faltered, its certainty cracking like ice in spring sunlight. For the first time in eons of existence, it faced something truly unpredictable, not human weakness overcome, but human nature transformed into something beyond its comprehension. This cannot. The patterns are absolute. Nothing is absolute, Astrid replied, gathering the collective strength of every guardian who had ever stood against the dark. Especially not entropy. Watch us prove it. The final assault began not with violence, but with creation itself. The creation that flowed through Astrid was unlike anything she had imagined possible. Where the void intelligence sought to simplify existence into nothingness, she and the Guardian Network began weaving new complexities, not chaotic, but purposeful patterns that grew stronger with each iteration. Reality bloomed around them like a flower opening to impossible sunlight. Where there had been the stark geometry of the space between worlds, gardens of crystallized time began to grow. Each guardian's essence contributed to the construction. The Romans' architectural precision, the Egyptians' understanding of stellar mathematics, the Druids' deep harmony with growing things, the Vikings' fierce joy in creation through destruction. The void intelligence recoiled further, its form beginning to fragment as it encountered something genuinely outside its conceptual framework. This violates fundamental principles. Order cannot increase without corresponding entropy. You're thinking too small, Astrid said, her consciousness expanding through dimensions she hadn't known existed moments before. You see the universe as a closed system running down toward heat death. But what if it's not closed? What if consciousness itself is the mechanism by which new energy enters reality? The revelation struck her with the force of falling stars. Every guardian who had ever stood vigil, every moment of sacrifice and determination, every choice to protect rather than preserve oneself, all of it had been adding something to existence that couldn't be measured in purely physical terms. The void entities weren't just wrong about human nature, they were wrong about the fundamental structure of reality itself. But even as triumph blazed through the network, Astrid felt the terrible weight of what completion would require. The pattern they were weaving demanded a final anchor, a consciousness willing to bind itself permanently to the structure they were creating. Someone had to become the keystone that would hold their construction stable across all possible timelines. The cost, the ancient guardian whispered, its presence heavy with millennia of understanding. There is always a cost. The choice crystallized before her with devastating clarity. She could step back, let another take the role of permanent anchor, and retain some shadow of her individual existence. Or she could accept the transformation that would dissolve her personal identity entirely, spreading her consciousness across the Guardian Network as a stabilizing force that would endure as long as reality itself. Through the connections that bound them all together, she felt her fellow Guardians' desperate protests. The Roman offered to take her place, his sense of duty demanding the sacrifice be his. The Egyptian warrior stepped forward with protective fury, unwilling to let another bear the burden. Even guardians she had barely touched reached out, offering their own dissolution if it would spare her. No, she said, her voice carrying finality that silenced their objections. This was always my path. From the moment I questioned my father's cruelty, from the first step toward my grandfather's longhouse, everything led to this choice. The void intelligence made one final desperate assault, not against the network, but against Astrid personally. It showed her visions of the life she would never have. Children who would carry her name, grandchildren gathered around her hearth, the simple human joys of growing old surrounded by love. It whispered of the clan that still needed her, the father who might yet forgive her, the brothers who would mourn her passing. You abandon them all for cosmic abstractions. Choose love over duty. Choose to live. For a moment, the weight of loss nearly broke her resolve. Every human instinct screamed against dissolution, against the abandonment of self that seemed like the ultimate defeat. But through the Guardian Network, she felt the truth that transcended individual desire. I'm not abandoning them, she said, her form already beginning to blur as she prepared for the final transformation. I'm becoming their eternal protector. Every child who will ever laugh, every parent who will ever sacrifice for love, every soul who will ever choose hope over despair, I'll be there, woven into the foundations of their reality. The ancient guardian's presence wrapped around her like a father's embrace as she took the final step. Your name will be forgotten by history, but your essence will endure in every moment that chooses light over darkness. Astrid Ironsdottir dissolved into light that was somehow warm despite its cosmic scope. Her consciousness spread through the Guardian network, becoming the living connection that bound them all together across space and time. Where she had been one woman fighting against abandonment, she became the force that ensured no defender would ever stand alone again. The void intelligence shrieked as its fundamental assumptions crumbled. Faced with a pattern of existence it couldn't comprehend or corrupt, it retreated deeper into the spaces between realities, its certainty shattered beyond repair. Through dimensions of awareness she had never imagined, Astrid felt the network stabilizing into permanent form. The barriers protecting reality grew stronger with each passing moment, fed by the continuous choice of consciousness to create rather than destroy. Her individual self was gone forever, but something immeasurably greater had taken its place. In losing everything she had been, she had become everything she had ever hoped to protect. The sacrifice was complete. The victory was eternal. Chapter 16, The Resolution. The chamber beneath her grandfather's longhouse materialized around what remained of the Guardian network, reality reasserting itself with the slow deliberation of tide returning to shore. Where moments before there had been the impossible geometries of space between worlds, familiar stone walls now stood solid and reassuring, though they seemed somehow more real than before, as if Astrid's transformation had strengthened the very foundations of existence itself. The Roman guardian was the first to speak, his voice carrying exhaustion that went deeper than bone. "It is finished, then." He stood where the crystalline void intelligence had been, his form more solid than she remembered from their first connection. Around the chamber, other guardians began to manifest, not as visions or psychic projections, but as physical presences drawn together by the network's new stability. The Egyptian warrior, her bronze skin marked with hieroglyphs that pulsed with residual power, moved to the center of the chamber where Astrid had made her final choice. "She is gone yet." Her words trailed off as she pressed her palm against the air, feeling something invisible but undeniably present. "I can sense her in everything. The very stones remember her sacrifice." "Not gone," the Celtic druid corrected gently, his antler crown casting strange shadows in the chamber's renewed light. "Transformed, distributed. She has become what we always struggled to maintain alone, the connection that binds all guardians across time and space." As he spoke, the runic inscriptions on the walls began to glow with soft warmth, Astrid's essence flowing through the ancient symbols like blood through veins. They stood in silence for a long moment, each processing what had transpired. The immediate threat was ended. The void intelligence's retreat had been absolute, its certainty shattered by patterns it could not comprehend. But victory carried a weight none of them had fully anticipated. Their sister-in-arms had purchased eternal protection for reality by sacrificing her individual existence, becoming something greater but no longer herself. The ancient guardian materialized last, his form more substantial than ever before, yet somehow more translucent as well. "The burden is lifted from us all," he said, his voice carrying relief that spanned millennia. "No longer must we stand vigil in isolation, wondering if our sacrifice has meaning. The network she created ensures that knowledge, strength, and purpose flow freely between all guardian sites. We are no longer alone." Through the enhanced connections, they could feel other guardians across the world emerging from their hidden sanctuaries, no longer broken by despair or driven to withdrawal by the weight of solitary duty. Defenders who had abandoned their posts in grief were returning to find their sacred sites renewed. Those who had fallen into madness from isolation felt sanity returning as Astrid's stabilizing presence flowed through their consciousness. "The world above," the Roman said quietly. "What of the natural order? We have changed fundamental forces. There will be consequences." The druid nodded thoughtfully. "Reality is stronger now, but also more aware. The barriers between worlds are reinforced, but the veil between seen and unseen grows thinner. Magic that has slept for centuries stirs again. The aurora borealis will dance with new colors, and sensitive souls will dream of distant guardians. They felt it then, a pulse through the network that was unmistakably Astrid, though transformed beyond recognition. It carried reassurance, affection, and something that might have been amusement. Even in dissolution, she was still somehow herself, still the fierce Viking woman who had questioned authority and chosen love over fear. "She wants us to return to our duties," the Egyptian interpreted, her hand still pressed to the space where Astrid had stood. "But not as we were before. The old isolation is ended. We can share knowledge, coordinate responses, even visit each other's sites when crises demand unified action." The ancient guardian moved toward the chamber's exit, his form beginning to fade as he prepared to return to his own sacred space. The immediate aftermath will be interesting. Reality has been fundamentally altered. Those with the sight will notice changes. Prophetic dreams will be clearer, sacred sites will pulse with visible energy, and the gifted will find their abilities enhanced. We must guide these transitions carefully. One by one, the other guardians began to depart, each returning to their own realms but no longer truly separate. The connections Astrid had forged remained strong, allowing instant communication and shared strength across any distance. What had been a scattered collection of isolated defenders had become a true network of protection. As the chamber emptied, warmth flowed through the ancient stones, Astrid's essence acknowledging her grandfather's longhouse, the place where her transformation had begun. The perfectly preserved warrior women in the hidden alcoves stirred, their eternal rest no longer needed now that the pattern had been completed. They dissolved peacefully into light, their vigil ended, their purpose fulfilled. Alone in the chamber that had witnessed such profound change, the ancient guardian paused at the threshold. Through the network, he could feel Astrid's presence in every guardian's sight across the world, not watching or guiding, but simply being there, ensuring that no defender would ever again face the darkness alone. The cosmic threat was ended. The eternal vigil would continue, but transformed, strengthened by sacrifice into something that could endure any challenge. The Longhouse stood ready for whatever came next. Chapter 17, The Return. 3 days passed before Astrid's consciousness found its way back to individual awareness. The sensation was like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Pieces of herself kept flowing away into the vast network she had become, only to trickle back with memories and experiences that weren't originally hers. She existed everywhere and nowhere, spread across the guardian sites yet somehow still centered in the chamber beneath her grandfather's longhouse. When she finally managed to gather enough of herself together to manifest, the form that appeared in the familiar stone chamber was both herself and not herself. She looked like Astrid Ironsdottir. The same wild blonde hair, the same fierce green eyes, the same warrior's build. But her skin held a faint luminescence, and when she moved, the air around her shimmered with barely contained power. The ancient guardian was waiting for her, his expression mixing profound relief with deep sorrow. "You came back," he said simply. "I never left," she replied, her voice carrying harmonics that echoed from distant guardian sites. "I'm everywhere now. But I chose to gather myself here, in the place where it all began." She touched the carved runes on the wall, feeling the stone respond to her presence like a living thing. "I wanted to see home again before you return to your clan," he finished. "Yes. That choice also has consequences." Through the network, Astrid could sense her father's war band camped 3 days' ride to the south. They had been searching for her since the failed raid, though whether for punishment or reconciliation remained unclear. What she felt from their distant thoughts was confusion, fear, and underneath it all, genuine grief. They believed her dead, lost to the winter forest that claimed so many who ventured too deep into its shadows. "I'm not the daughter who was banished," she said, studying her transformed hands. "I can't pretend to be simply Astrid anymore. The network flows through me. I carry the memories of every guardian who has ever stood vigil. When I speak, will it be my voice or theirs?" "Both," the ancient guardian replied. "You chose sacrifice, but you also chose to remain yourself within that sacrifice. The network needed an anchor with human understanding, human compassion. It needed you, specifically. She could feel the truth of it through connections that spanned centuries. The Roman guardian's duty, the Egyptian's protective fury, the Druid's deep wisdom, all of them flowed through her consciousness, but filtered through her own experiences, her own choices. She was still the woman who had questioned her father's cruelty, still the warrior who had chosen love over abandonment. The journey back to her clan's camp took only moments. Space meant little when she could step between guardian sites at will, but she chose to walk, giving herself time to practice containing her power, learning to appear fully human again. The winter forest recognized her passing, trees bending slightly in acknowledgement, the aurora borealis flaring overhead despite the morning sun. She found them breaking their fast around a dying fire, her father Jarl Iron sitting apart from the others, his weathered face bearing new lines of grief. Her brother Olaf was speaking quietly with the other warriors, planning another day of searching. They looked diminished somehow, as if her absence had taken more than just one fighter from their ranks. Astrid stepped into the clearing, deliberately making noise to announce her presence. The effect was immediate. Warriors leaped to their feet, hands moving to weapons before recognition struck them speechless. Olaf took a half-step forward, then stopped, his expression cycling rapidly through relief, joy, and growing unease. "Sister?" he whispered. "But you're different." She was grateful for his perception. Through the network, she could feel how she appeared to their eyes, like herself, but with an otherworldly quality that spoke of profound change. The sight that ran in their bloodline let them glimpse the power that flowed beneath her human appearance. "I am changed," she said simply, her voice carrying just enough of its new harmonics to confirm their instincts. "The forest taught me things, old things, true things." Her father rose slowly, his weathered hand resting on his sword hilt, not in threat, but in uncertainty. "What have you become, daughter?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Astrid felt the weight of absolute truth pressing against her lips. She could tell them everything, show them the cosmic scope of what she now protected. But she also felt the human wisdom that was still uniquely hers, the understanding that came from being the girl who had questioned and been cast out. "I've become what you always feared I was," she said with a slight smile. "Someone who refuses to accept that suffering is inevitable, someone who chooses to protect rather than conquer." She gestured to the camp around them. "The raids that have brought us nothing but loss and grief. There are better ways, Father, paths that lead to prosperity without requiring the tears of others." Through the network, she could already sense the changes beginning. The enhanced magic flowing through reality would soon make the old ways of raiding and conquest far more dangerous, while opening new possibilities for trade, exploration, and cooperation. The world was transforming, and those who adapted would thrive. Her father studied her for a long moment, then slowly removed his hand from his weapon. "Show us," he said quietly. Chapter 18, The New Beginning. The demonstration began simply. Astrid knelt by their dying fire and placed her palm against the cold ashes. Light flowed from her touch. Not the harsh glare of lightning, but the warm golden glow of summer sunshine. The embers rekindled instantly, flames dancing higher than they had any right to with so little fuel remaining. But more than fire returned. As the warmth spread through the camp, Astrid felt something else kindle: hope. She could sense it in her father's weathered features, see it in the way her brother straightened his shoulders. The warriors, who had spent 3 days searching through bitter cold, began to smile for the first time since the failed raid. "The old magic stirs again," she explained, letting just a fraction of the network's knowledge color her words. "But it responds to intention, not force, to protection, not destruction." She gestured toward the forest around them, where the trees seemed to lean closer, listening. "There are trade routes opening through lands that were once impassable, settlements that will welcome skilled craftsmen and brave explorers. Opportunities that require courage, yes, but not the courage to take from others." Her father's expression shifted through doubt, wonder, and finally, something that might have been relief. "The raids have brought us little but enemies and empty bellies," he admitted quietly. "If there are truly other ways." There are, Astrid said, rising to face him fully. Through the Guardian network, she could see the threads of possibility spreading out from this moment, futures where her clan became explorers rather than raiders, traders rather than conquerors. But it means changing everything we thought we knew about strength and honor. Olaf stepped forward, his young face bright with curiosity. The stories grandfather used to tell, about warriors who sailed beyond the edge of maps, who built great halls in distant lands through alliance rather than conquest. You're saying those weren't just stories? They were prophecy, Astrid replied, feeling her grandfather's presence warm and approving through the ancient connections. He knew this time would come, when the old ways would no longer serve and new paths would open. He prepared me for it, even if neither of us understood the full scope. Over the following hours, she showed them glimpses of what was possible. Her enhanced connection to the natural world let her find game trails invisible to ordinary sight. Freshwater springs that should have been frozen solid, sheltered paths through terrain that had seemed impassable. More importantly, she showed them how to see these things for themselves. The network had strengthened the latent magic in all humans, and those with the will to learn could develop extraordinary capabilities. By evening, the mood of the warband had transformed entirely. Warriors who had set out seeking vengeance or spoils were making plans for exploration and trade. Her father, his authority secure but his methods evolving, spoke of building alliances with distant settlements rather than raiding them. "You'll come home with us," he said, as they prepared to depart the next morning. It wasn't quite a question, but Astrid heard the uncertainty beneath his words. "For a time," she agreed. "I have responsibilities elsewhere now, duties that span far beyond our clan's territory, but I'll return regularly, and I'll never be truly absent." She touched her heart, where the network's connections pulsed like a second heartbeat. Distance means little when you're part of something larger than yourself. The journey home took 4 days, but they were unlike any travel Astrid had experienced before. Through the network, she could feel other guardians watching their progress, offering subtle assistance when the path grew difficult. The weather remained fair despite the season, game appeared when food ran low, and the warriors began to develop an almost mystical confidence in their ability to overcome obstacles. When they crested the final hill and saw their longhouse in the valley below, smoke rising from its hearth into the crisp air, Astrid felt something she had never expected to experience again: the pure joy of homecoming without the fear of abandonment. She would leave again many times as her duties required, but she would always return, and more importantly, she would never truly be gone. The clan that gathered to welcome them had already begun to change. Word of Astrid's transformation had spread through dreams and portents, carried by the enhanced magic that now flowed through all sensitive souls. Children spoke of visions where the aurora borealis spelled out new possibilities, and the clan's wise women reported prophetic dreams of prosperous voyages to lands beyond the horizon. That night, as the celebration feast filled their hall with warmth and laughter, Astrid stepped outside to watch the northern lights dance overhead. The aurora was brighter than ever before, shot through with colors that had no earthly names. Through the network, she could feel every guardian sight around the world, each one a beacon of protection and hope. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been cast out for questioning cruelty. She was no longer even entirely human. But she was still herself, still Astrid Ironsdottir, daughter of warriors, protector of her people. She had found her place in the cosmos without losing her place in the world. The new beginning stretched out before them all, bright with infinite possibility,